In the year 714, a man died who was not a king. His name was Pepin of Herstal, and across the fractured territories of the Franks, his death should have meant nothing beyond the grief of his family. Yet when word spread that Pepin had fallen, something unexpected happened. The kingdoms didn't celebrate their freedom from his shadow. They panicked, because for decades, this man who held no crown had been the only thing preventing their world from collapsing into chaos. The title he carried was Mayor of the Palace. It sounded administrative, almost clerical, but in practice it meant he commanded the armies, controlled the treasury, and made every decision that mattered. The Merovingian kings, descendants of Clovis who had once united the Frankish tribes, still sat on thrones. They still wore purple. They still received ceremonial oaths. But everyone knew the truth. The kings had become phantoms, kept alive only because tradition demanded a royal bloodline. Real power belonged to the mayors, and now the greatest of them was gone. Pepin's death exposed a question that had been festering for generations. If the kings were powerless and the mayors ruled in everything but name, what was the difference between legitimacy and pretense? The Merovingians clung to their heritage, to the sacred blood of Clovis, but that blood no longer commanded loyalty. It commanded pity. The mayors had built their authority on results, on victories in battle, on keeping the nobility in line. They had turned necessity into dominance, and Pepin of Herstal had perfected the arrangement. His death threatened to unravel it completely. In the months that followed, rival factions moved quickly. Pepin's widow, Plectrude, tried to secure power for her grandson, a child too young to inspire fear or respect. The nobles saw weakness. They saw opportunity. In Neustria, the Western Kingdom, a mayor named Ragnfrid seized control and began consolidating his position. He allied with the Frisians and the Saxons, enemies who had spent decades raiding Frankish lands. Together, they marched against Plectrude's forces. It looked like the beginning of a civil war that would shatter the Frankish world into pieces. But Plectrude had made a mistake. Years earlier, Pepin of Herstal had taken a concubine named Alpida. She bore him a son, a boy named Charles, who grew up outside the inner circles of power. He was illegitimate, politically inconvenient, a loose thread in the succession. When Pepin died, Plectrude had Charles imprisoned, a precaution to prevent him from claiming anything. It seemed like sound strategy. It was, in fact, the worst decision she could have made. Charles escaped. The records don't detail how, only that he appeared suddenly in Austrasia, the Eastern Kingdom, rallying support among nobles who saw in him something his rivals lacked: competence, ruthlessness, a willingness to fight without hesitation. In 717, Charles met Ragnfrid and the Neustrians in battle at Vinci. He won decisively. The next year, he crushed them again near Soissons. And then, systematically, he turned his attention to every enemy of the Franks, the Frisians, the Saxons, the Alemanni, the Bavarians. One by one, he brought them to heel, not through negotiation, through devastation. The nobles began calling him Charles Martel, Charles the Hammer. It wasn't affection, it was recognition. He didn't just defeat enemies, he broke them so thoroughly they couldn't rise again. And unlike his predecessors, Charles understood something essential. The Frankish world was surrounded by predators. To the north, pagan tribes raided coastlines and river valleys with impunity. To the east, Saxon warriors resisted every attempt at subjugation. But the most dangerous threat came from the south, from a force that had been growing in strength and ambition for nearly a century, the Umayyad Caliphate. An empire that stretched from the deserts of Arabia to the shores of the Atlantic, and it was expanding. In 732, an Umayyad army crossed the Pyrenees into Gaul. They had already conquered Hispania, the land that would one day be called Spain, sweeping aside Visigothic resistance in less than a decade. Now they moved north, raiding cities, gathering plunder, testing the limits of Christian resistance. The governor leading them, Abd al-Rahman al-Ghafiqi, commanded a force that had never known defeat in the west. His cavalry had broken armies from Damascus to the Pyrenees. They advanced toward the city of Tours, where one of the richest abbeys in Gaul held treasures accumulated over centuries. The monastery of Saint Martin contained gold, silver, jeweled relics, and manuscripts that represented generations of wealth and devotion. It seemed like another raid, another victory in a long series of conquests. But between the Umayyads and Tours stood Charles Martel, and he had no intention of letting them pass. The armies met near Poitiers in October. The Umayyad cavalry, fast and fluid, had terrorized opponents across 2 continents. Their tactics relied on speed, on feints, on breaking enemy formations through waves of mounted charges. But Charles had prepared his men for exactly this kind of warfare. He formed them into a defensive wall, shields locked, refusing to break formation no matter how many attacks came. The Frankish infantry had trained for months to hold position against cavalry. They wore heavy armor, carried long spears, and understood that survival depended on discipline. For hours, the Umayyad horsemen crashed into the Frankish lines. For hours, the Franks held. Warriors fell on both sides, but the shield wall never broke. And then, as the battle reached its apex, Charles ordered a counterattack aimed directly at the Umayyad camp, where supplies and plunder were kept. The maneuver was calculated. If the camp fell, the entire campaign collapsed. The enemy command fractured. Abd al-Rahman fell in the chaos, struck down as he tried to rally his forces. By dawn, the Umayyad army was retreating south, abandoning their wounded and much of their equipment. And Charles had secured something more valuable than victory. He had secured a legend. Christians across Europe saw the Battle of Tours as divine intervention. Charles became the defender of Christendom. The man who had turned back an unstoppable tide. Monasteries recorded the battle in chronicles that spread throughout the continent. Bishops praised him in sermons. The Pope sent letters of gratitude, but Charles himself saw it more practically. He had proven that the Franks could stand against any threat, no matter how formidable. And with that proof came leverage. The nobility, who had once viewed the mayors with suspicion, now depended on Charles for protection. The church, which had maintained cautious distance from the illegitimate son of Pepin, now embraced him as a champion. The Merovingian king, Theuderic IV, remained on the throne in name, but his presence had become irrelevant. When Theuderic died in 737, Charles didn't bother replacing him. For 4 years, there was no king at all. The illusion had finally collapsed. The mayors no longer needed the pretense. Power was enough. Charles spent the remainder of his life consolidating that power. He subdued the Frisians in the north, forcing their chieftains to accept Frankish overlordship and Christian baptism. He campaigned against the Saxons repeatedly, pushing the borders of Frankish influence eastward into territories that had never submitted to any foreign authority. He intervened in disputes among the Bavarians and Alemanni, ensuring that no rival power could emerge to challenge his dominance. And he reformed the military structure of the Frankish kingdom, redistributing church lands to warriors who would serve him directly. It was a controversial move. Bishops protested the seizure of monastic properties. Abbots complained that sacred lands were being turned into rewards for soldiers. But Charles understood that loyalty required material incentive, and land was the currency of loyalty. The warriors he equipped with church estates became the backbone of Frankish military power for generations. When Charles Martel died in 741, he passed that power to his sons, Carloman and Pepin. They divided the realm between them, continuing their father's campaigns, extending Frankish influence deeper into Italy and beyond the Rhine. Carloman took Austrasia, the heartland of Carolingian strength. Pepin received Neustria and Burgundy, the territories that had once resisted their family's rise. Together, they maintained the system their father had built, ruling without a Merovingian king, justifying their authority through military success and administrative competence. But in 747, Carloman made an unexpected choice. He abdicated. He gave up his position, entered the monastery of Monte Cassino in Italy, and left the entire inheritance to Pepin. It was the kind of decision that seemed impossibly naive, the sort of move that invited disaster in an age when brothers routinely murdered each other for power. But it gave Pepin something his father never had: undivided authority, and Pepin intended to use it. The Merovingian line still existed, barely. In 743, under pressure from noble factions who insisted on maintaining tradition, Carloman and Pepin had installed a king named Childeric III. He was a figurehead without function or influence, a man whose name appeared on documents, but who made no decisions, commanded no armies, controlled no resources. Pepin looked at this arrangement and saw the final obstacle to complete legitimacy. He wanted more than power. He wanted a mandate that couldn't be questioned, that couldn't be undermined by claims of usurpation or illegitimacy. So in 750, he sent a delegation to Rome with a question for Pope Zachary. Who should be king? The man who holds the title, or the man who holds the power? The Pope's answer was unambiguous. The man who holds the power should be king. It was a calculated response. Rome needed protection from the Lombards who threatened the papal territories, who had been encroaching on church lands for decades with increasing aggression. Pepin needed sanctification, the blessing of the church to transform his de facto rule into de jure kingship. The exchange was political, transactional even, but it carried profound consequences. In 751, Pepin was anointed king of the Franks in a ceremony at Soissons. Saint Boniface, the missionary who had spent decades converting Germanic tribes, performed the ritual. Oil was poured over Pepin's head, prayers were offered, and the Merovingian dynasty ended. Childeric III was sent to a monastery, his hair shorn in the traditional sign of humiliation and powerlessness. The Carolingians, a family that had spent 3 generations building power from the shadows, had finally claimed the throne. And they would hold it for the next 2.5 centuries. Pepin's reign was methodical and strategic. He crushed a rebellion in Aquitaine, forcing Duke Waifar to submit after years of resistance and guerrilla warfare. He crossed the Alps in 754 to defend Pope Stephen II from the Lombards. The campaign was brutal and effective. Pepin besieged Pavia, extracted promises from the Lombard king Aistulf, and returned to Francia with plunder and enhanced prestige. When the Lombards violated their oaths and threatened Rome again, Pepin returned in 756. This time, he didn't just defeat them. He seized territory in central Italy, the Exarchate of Ravenna and surrounding regions, and donated it to the papacy in what became known as the Donation of Pepin. It established the Papal States, a temporal domain that would shape European politics for more than 1,000 years. The Church now had land, revenue, military protection, and political independence, and the Carolingians had earned something invaluable in return: papal support, a relationship that would elevate the dynasty beyond anything the Merovingians had achieved. But Pepin's greatest contribution to history wasn't military conquest or political maneuvering. It was his son. In 748, his wife Bertrada of Leon gave birth to a boy they named Charles. He would grow into a man of extraordinary ambition, standing nearly 6.5 feet tall in an age when most men barely reached 5.5. He possessed his grandfather's strategic brilliance and his father's understanding of legitimacy. He combined ruthlessness with vision, military prowess with administrative genius. History would call him Charlemagne, Charles the Great. And he would take everything his grandfather and father had built and transform it into an empire that would reshape the entire structure of European civilization. When Pepin died in 768, the kingdom was divided once more according to Frankish custom. Charles ruled the north, centered on Austrasia and the lands along the Rhine. His younger brother Carloman ruled the south, controlling Burgundy, Provence, Septimania, and Aquitaine. For 3 years, they coexisted in an arrangement that satisfied tradition but created constant tension. The brothers disagreed on policy, on military strategy, on the treatment of rebellious nobles. Their mother Bertrada attempted to mediate, arranging marriages and diplomatic alliances to maintain peace between them. But the underlying instability remained. The structural problem of divided authority in a world that demanded unified command. Then, in 771, Carloman died suddenly at his villa in Samusi. He was only 20 years old. Some chronicles mention illness, others hint at more suspicious circumstances, though nothing conclusive survives in the historical record. What is certain is that Charles moved with remarkable speed to absorb his brother's entire kingdom. Carloman's widow Gerberga fled with her young sons to the Lombard court, seeking the protection of King Desiderius. Charles didn't pursue them immediately. He had larger strategic concerns. The Lombards were threatening Rome yet again, and the new pope, Adrian I, was calling desperately for help. Charles invaded Italy in 773 with an army that dwarfed anything his father had fielded. He crossed the Alps, swept aside Lombard defenses, and laid siege to Pavia, the capital where Desiderius had taken refuge. The siege lasted through the winter, a grinding test of endurance and supply lines. By spring, starvation forced the Lombard king to surrender. Charles entered Pavia in triumph, deposed Desiderius, and claimed the Iron Crown of Lombardy for himself. King of the Franks and King of the Lombards, 2 kingdoms united under one ruler. It was a template he would repeat across Europe for the next 3 decades, a pattern of conquest, absorption, and consolidation that would extend Carolingian power from the Atlantic to the Danube, from the North Sea to the Mediterranean.